Saturday afternoon. A second group of 100 Tokyo firefighters is joining the first 140-member group at the site. Using a special vehicle that can project water from a height of 22 meters, members of the first group sprayed seawater on the number 3 reactor's storage pool for spent nuclear fuel rods. The storage pool has lost its cooling function, raising the risk of a massive radiation leak. Officials say a total of 60 tons of seawater was successfully sprayed into the building during a 20-minute operation early Saturday morning. There's a pressing need to cool fuel at the Daiichi nuclear power plant, so workers are carrying out an unprecedented operation to restore the supply of electricity there.
The problem started at the plant after it lost the power to keep feeding the reaction and storage pools with water. When the cooling systems shut down, experts immediately began looking for ways to connect the plant to outside power sources. A number of options were considered. Experts have decided on an idea that came to them in an emergency drill conducted at the number 5 reactor last November.
This is a video and training conducted based on the fact that the cooling function had been compromised.
But this time around, it wasn't one reactor, but all 6 that lost power. 4 also lost their emergency backup power, something the plant's operators never thought could happen. Ryuichi Shimada, professor at the Tokyo Institute of Technology, says nobody had ever expected problems on this scale. He says he can't imagine how to go about dealing with them, and he says the people at the plant will also have been baffled as to what should be done. In today's plan, work is divided into 3 tasks. 1, to restore cables at number 1 and number 2 reactors. Another at the number 3 and 4 reactors, and repairs to the power system at number 5 and 6 reactors. For the number 3, 4, 5 and 6 reactors, workers plan to use cables originally installed to send out power generated at the plant. The plan is to use it as a power source by drawing electricity from outside sources. The utility company is rushing to first finish restoration of the power system at the number 2 reactor. Why does the company give higher precedence to the number 2 reactor, although its building has hardly been damaged? The Nuclear and Industry Safety Agency official says it's because the building is undamaged. It's difficult to put water into it from outside. He says it's necessary to restore the cooling system by repairing the power system. About 20 people are working on the number 2 reactor. Electricity from outside power sources reaches the reserve transformer on the ground. A power cable is to be laid over a distance of 1.5 kilometers to reach a temporary transformer near the reactor building. Workers plan to lay the cable through the buildings of the number 1 and 3 reactors to connect it to another transformer in the number 2 reactor. This way, they plan to send electric power to all 6 reactors. Restoration work at the damaged plant faces a number of problems. The biggest issue is how to shield workers from radiation. Radiation of 10 millisieverts per hour has been observed near the number 1 reactor and 15 millisieverts per hour near the number 2 reactor. This Tokyo Electric Power Company official says the operation must be carried out based on levels of radiation observed in place. Workers involved are required to put on protective gear. The maximum tolerable amount of radiation each worker is to be exposed to during one stint is set at 100 millisieverts. It's hard work carried out in the dark, in a race against time. The restoration of power does not resolve the whole problem. Most of the motors and switchboards at the plant have been submerged by the tsunami and they cannot be used. Thorough examination must be carried out to determine whether there is a leakage of electricity and whether some machines and switchboards remain usable. If there are problems, work is necessary to replace unusable motors with new ones and rearrange the joints of the switchboards.
The Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency says 2 reactors at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant are resuming cooling functions. At a news conference earlier on Saturday, officials said they have confirmed that a power generator at the number 6 reactor has been reactivated. They have also found that the coolant pump at the number 5 reactor is operable. Both reactors had previously been cooled by a single emergency diesel power generator.
For reactor number 6, now it has a second power source, which is now being used for cooling. For reactor number 5, there is a pump now working, and this is getting power supply, and so cooling is now possible with existing facilities.
Meanwhile, radiation of 830.8 microsieverts per hour was recorded at a point about 1.1 kilometers from the number 3 reactor at 8:10 local time on Saturday, which officials say is relatively high. The level gradually decreased to 364.5 microsieverts by 9 a.m. The World Health Organization has said radiation levels outside the evacuation zone in Japan are not harmful for human health.
Outside the 30-kilometer radius, there have been very low levels of radiation measured. And we understand, of course, the concern of people living outside the 30-kilometer radius that they might be affected. But the evidence so far, the radiation levels measured, would say that there's little public health danger from the radiation there. So if you're living in Tokyo or Yokohama metropolitan area or further afield, there is little public health risk.
WHO spokesperson Gregory Hartl was speaking at a regular news conference in Geneva on Friday. He said that WHO finds no public health reason to avoid travel to Japan except to the affected areas or to recommend that foreign nationals leave the country. Some countries are encouraging their citizens to leave Japan or are moving their embassies from Tokyo to Osaka. Referring to an examination of Japanese food imports by some countries, he said he cannot imagine that any food from the quake-damaged areas could have been delivered since the tremor. He said he concludes that there is no risk of exported Japanese food being contaminated with radiation. 1 week has passed since the magnitude 9 earthquake hit northeastern Japan. The number of dead has reached over 7,000, the worst ever death toll in a natural disaster in Japan since World War II. Nearly 20,000 are still missing. Japan's National Police Agency says 7,197 deaths have been confirmed, and over 18,000 people remain unaccounted for. The death toll exceeds that of the Great Hanshin earthquake in 1995, which killed 6,434. More than 280,000 people are taking shelter, mainly in 3 prefectures in the Tohoku region, northeastern Japan. Many of the shelters are short of food, water, and other essential supplies. Relief efforts are being hampered by a shortage of fuel for trucks and ambulances. Evacuees in the shelters are facing chilly weather. Weather officials warn that high tides are likely to last for 1 week from Saturday. Some ground levels in quake-hit areas have sunk, leaving coastal areas vulnerable to flooding. But officials say the threat from tides is not like that from a tsunami, as people will have time to act given that sea levels will increase gradually. We earlier reported that a man had been miraculously rescued 8 days after the massive earthquake and tsunami hit eastern Japan. But as it turns out, the man escaped the initial disaster, went back to his home in Miyagi Prefecture, and fell unconscious.
2階にですね、布団にくるまった状態でいました。体調はちょっと衰弱したような感じでしたね。
Self-Defense Force personnel found the man in his house in Kesennuma City on Saturday. He told rescuers that he left after the first tsunami, but then returned home and fell unconscious. The man in his 20s is being treated at a hospital. Doctors say he sustained no major injuries. It's not only the earthquake and tsunami that has caused massive damage. Fires carried along by the surging water also wreaked havoc. The destructive power of this triple threat has alarmed disaster management experts.
NHK footage of Friday's tsunami shows an unlikely combination of water and fire. In fact, the water here carries 4 separate blazes. Moving as fast as the tsunami, they set other objects on fire along the way. What's causing these blazes? The water swept up many cars. The waves also tossed big ships around. The vessels and cars carry engine fuel. And ports have large oil tanks like this one.
海には油でしょうか。海には大量の油が流れ出ています。
A small spark can start a blaze that could spread quickly. Many coastal towns were on fire. Shigeo Takahashi studies multiple disasters. The footage confirms what he had feared might happen in a worst-case scenario.
We may call them tsunami fires, a new warning. Massive fires may follow right after the destructive force of tsunamis.
This footage comes from Ofunato City in Iwate Prefecture. Minutes after the tsunami strikes, the town is ablaze. Three kilometers inland, residents do what they can to stop fires from spreading. Volunteers plug fire hoses into the hydrants. But their efforts are in vain. The tsunami had damaged the town's water supply system. In Kesennuma City in Miyagi Prefecture, widespread fires leveled houses that the tsunami hadn't destroyed. An amateur video shows fires spreading around the port of Kesennuma. This is just 3 hours after the tsunami had swept through. At about 8 p.m., the self-defense forces flew over the area, looking on as the fire engulfed hillside communities. Residents say the first sign of the big fire started 5 hours after the quake. In just 2 hours, multiple fires were recorded across town. Firefighters had no effective way to combat the raging blazes. On day 5, more fires break out in the center of Kesennuma. The city is still reeling from the effects of triple disasters, and the people are using all their resources to fight back.
And here's a look at the world weather forecast. And we wrap up with images of firefighters who will resume spraying seawater into the storage pool inside the number 3 reactor building at the quake-hit Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. The unmanned operation will continue for 7 hours starting on Saturday afternoon. That's all for this edition of NHK World Newsline. We'll be back with more updates. You're watching NHK World Newsline. I'm Sherry Yan. The Tokyo Fire Department will resume spraying seawater into the storage pool inside the number 3 reactor building at the quake-hit Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. They say they will continue the unmanned operation for 7 hours starting on Saturday.